Hi folks, welcome to Migrating to the Google Ads API. Here we'll cover topics related to the Google Ads API and how it's different from the AdWords API, which will be sunset in April 2022. Quick intro, my name is Sasha and I'm a developer advocate on the Google Ads API team, and I'm based in the New York office. Before we dive into the Google Ads API, I want to explain how this webinar will work. At the top of your screen, you should see a link to Q&A, and you can submit questions at any time. Then at the end of the webinar, engineers and members of my team will answer your questions. You can also upvote questions others have asked, so if you see something that interests you, please upvote it. We'll generally be taking the most upvoted questions first. Now onto our agenda. We have a lot to cover, so what we'll start with is with broad changes, and then move to reporting and queries. Then we'll cover mutates, then new and improved features. Next, I'll dive into some code and show you a micro-migration, and following that, we'll cover some migration best practices, and then wrap up with some key resources and then answers to your questions. As mentioned in the blog post announcing this webinar, we suggest reading or even just skimming our migration guide, as this webinar builds heavily upon that. You can find our guide on the migration tab of our Google Ads API documentation site. There's one particular resource on the page I'd like to explicitly call out, which is the API services map. This table shows all the services in AdWords and their corresponding Google Ads API services. I recommend bookmarking this. And with that out of the way, let's dive into broad changes. Arguably, the biggest change is the protocols and formats used for API request and response transport. In AdWords, you had XML over SOAP. SOAP first appeared in 1998, and since then there have been many improved alternatives, two of which are supported in the Google Ads API. Number one is protocol buffers, or protobufs for short, which transports over gRPC. And two is JSON, which transports over REST. Let's take a brief look at these. Protobufs over gRPC are extremely space efficient and result in smaller payloads because they're binary encoded. Protobufs are also great because they automatically enforce certain data type correctness for both requests and responses. An example of this is enforcing numbers for certain fields and strings for others, or enforcing the presence of certain fields. If you use our client libraries, you get protobufs and gRPC for free, no assembly required. For JSON over REST, this is relatively similar to what you'd see with other APIs, and by comparison with protobufs, JSON has a larger payload size. One difference is that JSON over REST without a client library won't have that nice data type enforcement I mentioned earlier. But on the other hand, you can also use JSON over REST very easily with things like curl, Postman, or other developer tools and runtimes. One difference to call out with protobufs versus JSON, empty values in protobufs are semantically different than empty or missing values in JSON, and this has implications that will be addressed later in this section as well as in the mutate section. You also might have noticed that I referred to client libraries on this slide. With the Google Ads API, we've also released all new client libraries for Java, Python, .NET, PHP, Ruby, and Perl. By default, most client libraries use gRPC. Perl is an exception because protobufs aren't available in Perl. PHP and Ruby also support switching to REST for transport, and other client libraries may join them in the future. And if it turns out that none of these runtimes works for you, there is also another option. You can use REST directly. There's a large number of stable and quality frameworks and modules for JSON over REST, but if there are some important things to mention about REST with the Google Ads API. The design of the Google Ads API over REST is a little different than you might be used to with other REST APIs. One thing I'd like to highlight is that most API endpoints will actually utilize the post-HTTP method, even certain non-mutating calls like search. There are other differences too that I suggest you read about on our REST documentation page, which is shown at the bottom of the screen. REST-specific considerations aside, we highly recommend using our client libraries. While gRPC is a cool and modern technology, when you use our client libraries, you don't have to know very much about it. In fact, using the client libraries means you don't have to think about gRPC, REST, or OAuth. Our client libraries do the heavy lifting to make it easier for you to just use Google Ads. And to help make this migration even easier, we've made it so that you can use both APIs at the same time. You can use them at the same time from the same app or runtime with the same credentials. You can literally use both APIs and both sets of client libraries from the same executable or interpreter. Our migration code examples highlight this, and I'll demonstrate this later. Identical parts aside, there are some differences to consider when it comes to authentication and authorization. A super simple and minor difference is the config file format. Some identifiers and key constants have changed, with the highlighted example in Java showing the new package name. Keep in mind your client library of choice will have different changes, but they should be pretty similar. Moving on to other simple changes, we've changed where some parameters live. For client customer ID, partial failure, and validate only, you now pass these parameters in a request body, so they're on a per request basis. The biggest impact is felt for client customer ID, where you no longer need to construct a new API client to change customer IDs. And this ties in very nicely with a new feature we've introduced, which is login customer ID. This works in tandem with client customer ID moving to the request body. You set the login customer ID in your config to the top level manager account, and when requests with that specific API client, you pass in client customer ID to access any child's account's resources. We think this change will make sub-account access much easier for you. Moving on, we're going to talk about format changes. The first format we'll cover is identifiers. In AdWords API, to query for resources, you needed to use a collection of IDs for that object. For instance, an ad required a customer ID, an ad group ID, and an ad ID. In the Google Ads API, however, we've introduced the concept of resource names, which are kind of like URIs for API resources, and that simplifies this. The same object IDs from AdWords correspond to path components and resource names in Google Ads. The other point about resource names are that they're globally unique, so they're great to persist in your database as pointers or records to Google Ads resources. Resource names are also returned by many methods by default, and likewise, you can also use them to request specific resources. And we've made constructing resource names very easy with helper functions available in our client libraries. Just pass the respective object IDs into the helper function to create a resource name. Another change we've made to formats is with types and enumerations. In the AdWords API, types and enumerations were string constants. Now in the Google Ads API, these are proper enumerated constants. There are a couple of things to point out here. There are helper functions available to convert between constant name and constant value. You can see the prototypes for these functions on the bottom of the PHP code sample. Another thing to call out is the addition of unspecified and unknown. Unspecified means no value, empty value, or null value. This option is necessary because protocol buffers require a named default or zero value for every field. This has another implication that I'll cover in mutates. The next new option is unknown. This option will be populated for you by the server or the client library itself and indicates that the client library or server does not have a name defined for the value provided. This will happen if the client library version is different from the server version, such as using the v6 client library after v6.1 has been released. You should explicitly handle this case in your error handling. Speaking of error handling, we actually had a previously broadcast webinar on this subject by my colleague Andrew. I highly recommend this webinar. It's pretty great. And with that, we can move on to one of the most important topics to many of you, reporting. There are a great number of changes to reporting. So before we go deeper, let's look at an overview. From the top, AdWords query language has become Google Ads query language. To save some syllables, I'll refer to it as GACL going forward. Do keep in mind that this isn't actually just a name change, it's semantically pretty different too, and we'll cover that in a bit. Then, the biggest change in my opinion is that reporting, object retrieval, and querying has been unified. The primary interfaces to reports are now the Google Ads the Google Ads Service, Search Stream, and Search methods. Let's cover those now. Search Stream is going to be the most commonly used query tool in your toolbox. As its name suggests, it streams requests, so it's great for high throughput and large result sets. Search Stream will only return the fields you explicitly select in your query. A consideration to keep in mind for Search Stream is that you must reissue the request if there is an interruption, such as a network fault. And then next up is plain old search. This is a slightly more specialized method we found works great for paged user interfaces. It's good for results that are smaller than 10,000 rows. More than that, you're going to want to use Search Stream. And just like Search Stream, this method type only returns the selected fields. A nice feature of this method is that the individual pages are cached by the server, and if a query is interrupted, you can pick up where you left off by using the page ID. A consideration for plain old search is that it can be a slower query and may be prone to timeouts with very large result sets. We do have one more reporting request type, but it's vastly different from search stream and search, and that's GET. This is different because it's not built to be performant for production environments. GET returns a fully populated resource, which is distinctly different from search stream and search. This method really only exists for you, the developer, and it's meant for troubleshooting. Because of that focus, there is a request limit of 1,000 requests per day. So I do want to hit pause and call something out. That is a very big semantic change from AdWords. Before, GET requests were a common way of pulling resources, but in the Google Ads API, that's not the case. In the Google Ads API, you should default to using search stream unless you have a justification for the search method, and only when you need to debug should you consider using the GET method. So that's what the different reporting request types look like. One thing I haven't covered yet is what a search stream or search request looks like. For that, we have Gackle. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a side-by-side with the AdWords query language. Okay, at first glance, they look pretty similar. Both have select and from clauses, but Gackle has moved the during clause to the where clause. Additionally, it looks like the field names have changed a bit. There's actually a lot more different between these two query languages, so let's take a more complicated query and break it down line by line. And actually, these next few slides might look familiar to you as they were covered in a previous webinar, but I think these concepts are important enough that I'd like to quickly review them here. So we're going to go through the different fields and clauses one by one. There are a lot of different fields and a lot of them have different semantics, so they've been color-coded to highlight which semantic group they're related to. One thing to keep in mind as we go through this is that these semantic groups have different effects on the number of rows returned in the response, and I will call those differences out as we get to them. So up first is from. Just like with the AdWords query language, this is the primary resource you're selecting from. What's new here is resource views, which include other fields and data that maps to reports. In fact, reports in AdWords have mapped to either resource or resource views. We have a doc that maps this to make migration easier. I suggest bookmarking this because you'll very likely need it. Okay, moving on to the select clause. This is pretty standard. The first two fields are directly off the main resource, which is ad group, and you can see that in our from clause. Next in the select clause are metrics. Metrics fields expose all the data you want and need to generate your reports. Next are attributed resources. Notice that these are off a resource other than what's in our from clause. Basically, you can think of these fields as an implicit left join, a join that you get for free. And after that is segments. These fields behave pretty differently from the others. The fields before this had no impact on the number of rows returned. Segments, however, do impact the number of rows returned. Segmented queries return a row for every combination of the main resource and the various segment values. This means that there will be an additional row returned for every distinct segment value, but with the same main resource name. They're a little like group by clauses, except they expand to more rows rather than reduce to fewer. That might be a little confusing, so I think it will help if we can visualize this. Okay, so let me explain what's going on. The colorful table on the left is showing only a couple of key fields that would be returned by the query to the right. I've dropped a number of fields, like ad group name, for example. I'm also not going to show values for certain columns at all, like the middle two columns. In the actual table, starting at the left is our ad group ID, and then column 2 is some metrics where the values were omitted, and then column 3 is our implicit join. Same deal, values hidden. And then column 4 will correspond to the segments.device field. What you'll see is that the ad group ID remains the same for the various segment values. That would be true of the values in the campaign column 2 if they were shown. So this is simultaneously a little like group by and also not like it. Segmenting splits the selected metrics, grouping by each segment in the select clause. Moving on to the where clause. The where clause should be pretty self-explanatory, and is generally very SQL-like, with the exception of the during subclause syntactic sugar. It makes it pretty easy for you to reproduce standard reporting windows. Next, order by and limit. These two are very SQL-like and behave as you would expect. There's a lot more nuance to GACL than what I covered, and if you want to learn more, you should check out the Intro to Reporting and GACL webinar by my colleague Devin. This is an in-depth dive into GACL that includes a lot more examples. I highly recommend watching it. Devin did a great job. And actually, Devin also made some query tools to help out with your migrations. Over the next few slides, I'm going to highlight a couple of these. Tool number 1 is the migration tool, which allows you to convert an AdWords query language query directly into a GACL query. Now keep in mind that you'll likely want to customize any queries you convert this way, but this is a great starting point and will save you a lot of time. Tool number 2 is the Interactive Query Builder. This is a completely rewritten version of the interactive AdWords Query Builder, and it has a slew of new features to help you out. The coolest thing, in my opinion, is that it interactively shows you which fields you can select or where on based on your current selections. Definitely play around with this. It will give you a great feel for GACL. And then tool number 3 is the Query Validator, which allows you to take your own GACL query string and validate it. So we've talked a lot about querying so far, but there is another piece to the puzzle. As ads developers, you perform a lot of mutates, and we've added a number of features to make this easier for you. The biggest change is something we call a unified data model. In a nutshell, this means that you can take objects from responses and use them directly in subsequent API requests. To understand the impacts of this change, let's go over what mutates sometimes looked like in the AdWords API. Okay, so to perform a mutate, first you download a report. This report is a CSV file that you would then need to parse, and once you've parsed that CSV file to make it usable, you need to construct objects. And once you got to that point, then you're finally ready to mutate or edit the objects. And with all that complete, you can now send the mutate request. Okay, I'm getting a little bit out of breath. There's a lot of steps there. So what does this look like in the Google Ads API? Okay, we'll start with a search request. That's pretty similar. And then we can actually skip directly to editing. You can edit the object directly from the response from the search request. You don't need to parse a CSV. You don't need to construct any objects. We actually have done all that for you. And now you can send your mutate request. That's it. We think this is really going to make mutates much more ergonomic. There is one more piece to the mutate puzzle, and we're going to cover that now. That's field masks. This is a completely new concept in the Google Ads API, and this comes to us from protocol buffers. Recall that protocol buffers require named default or empty values. With protocol buffers, empty fields mean absence, unlike JSON. So this means if you try to perform a mutate with an object you get back from the API, you might overwrite or clobber fields that weren't selected in your original query. To mitigate this, you can use field masks. In this example, we're going to walk through enabling all paused campaigns for an account. So in our PHP example, we'll start with a GACL search that selects all campaigns that are paused. Note that we've requested that only the campaign resource name field is populated. And then once we've got our campaigns, we can mutate our objects. Here, we iterate through all of the rows. In this case, there's a one-to-one relationship with rows and paused campaigns. Then we set each campaign to enabled. After that, we create a campaign operation and specify that we're updating. Then comes the field masks business. We create a new field mask and then specify the paths. In this case, that's only the status field. Finally, we have a list of campaign operations set to mutate the status field. Now, we can send the mutate request. And that's pretty much all there is to field masks. Just remember to specify which fields you're mutating in update operations. So one thing I haven't covered yet is what actually gets returned by this mutate request. What is its response type? Well, there's two response types supported by the Google Ads API. The first is what you briefly saw in the field masks example, the resource name only response type. This is the default, and as the name suggests, only includes the resource name. The other response type you can specify is mutable resource. This response type returns a resource with all of its mutable fields populated with the current value. One thing to keep in mind is that not all resources support mutable resource. On the next slide is an example of a resource's response type. Here you can see the two available fields, resource name and in this case campaign. And remember, campaign will only be set if you requested a mutable resource. Let's take a look at this in practice. On the left, you have the default of resource name only, and on the right, mutable resource. These are both examples of sending a mutate request and specifying in the parameters a response content type. Either the resource name only type or the mutable resource type are the options that you'll pass in to response content type. Cool. So we've talked about what's changed. Now let's talk about new and improved features. In this section, I'm going to quickly review some of the new and improved features. We're not actually going to have time for all of them, but we will touch on the most exciting. One thing to keep in mind is that these new and improved features are only available in the Google Ads API. So here are some of those features. Let's dive into account management. We've updated this and split it into two different services, each representing a different perspective, either the manager account or a sub-account. And those perspectives are related to the account linking process. So to extend an invitation as a manager, you'll now use the customer client link service, and then to accept an invitation as a client, you'll use the customer manager link service. Okay, tongue twister, nice. Next up is billing and invoices. The biggest change is now you can modify who pays by specifying a billing setup, and you can also control budgets directly via the API. And something we think many of you will be excited about is you can now fetch invoices via the Google Ads API. That's generally available, so there's no need to worry about any allow lists. A feature that's exclusively new to the Google Ads API is optimization score and recommendations. You can fetch available recommendations as well as their optimization score impacts, and then applying a recommendation requires only a single API request. There's a lot more that's new and improved with the Google Ads API. And just remember, all new and updated features will be exclusive to the new Google Ads API. Next up, I'm going to do something different. We've done a lot of theory so far, but now let's apply some of this. Let's migrate a couple of services in a micro-migration. In a few slides, I'm going to switch to a code editor and show you a variant of one of the examples we have in our PHP client library. The example starts with an AdWords-only implementation I've pre-written. The implementation performs a couple of tasks: creating a campaign with a budget, creating an ad group, creating some expanded text ads, and then adding some keywords. Then together, we're going to create fork points and incrementally add Google Ads implementations for the tasks above. As we add those tasks, we'll swap between the branches of the forks to demonstrate an incremental migration. This pattern of an incremental forked migration is then something we'll cover after the demo, but with an eye towards a larger scope. Cool. So here I am in my terminal, and I've prepared a demo project in PHP that we're going to use to demonstrate how to move from the AdWords API to the Google Ads API in an incremental fashion, and also kind of highlight some of the key points from earlier on in the webinar. So let me give you a quick tour so you can kind of orient yourself and do a quick hello world. So I've got two classes here, the campaign management class and the AdWords API class. These are both classes that I wrote just for the purposes of the demo. They're not related to the client libraries. So the first class is this very high-level kind of director, which uses the AdWords API to perform a bunch of functions. So the first function is create a campaign budget. Second one is create a campaign, then create an ad group, and then create text ads, and then create keywords. And notice that it's calling the AdWords API for all of these. Then in the actual AdWords API class, let's move down here, in this class, I've defined those same respective functions. So create campaign budget, create campaign budget, create campaign, create ad group, create text ads, and create keywords. And so campaign management calls into this. So let's demonstrate that this works properly to gain some confidence, right? So I have like a runner script run example, which calls into this with some decoration. Cool. So if we take a quick look, everything looks like it worked. Let me just scroll up here a little bit. Okay. Right. So what's going on here? Yep. These are all successful calls. Yes. Great. So now what I'm going to do is move back into my campaign management class and start adding some scaffolding so that we can begin using the Google Ads API incrementally. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change our arguments to the run example function to include a Google Ads API client. Cool. So I've added Google Ads client and customer ID. These aren't used anywhere yet. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the existing call to AdWords API and move it into an if statement into the else clause. Let me just center this for you. Cool. So I've added this to an if statement, and at the moment this if statement actually will break our example because it's not producing the kind of necessary dependencies that we need. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a call to a future Google Ads API class that we're going to add and make and work on together. And I'm going to add that right. Great. Okay, so this is a pretty clear mapping from AdWords API. This is a class right here that doesn't exist yet. We're going to create it in a second. Same method name, and then the Google Ads API client from above, and then customer ID from above too. Cool. So let's go ahead and make this new Google Ads API class. So cool. So I have this scaffolding for this class here. The class doesn't do anything yet. So technically, if we were to run this example with this using this new branch of this fork, it's not going to work yet. So what I'm going to do next is start kind of filling in the blanks and implementing a bit of this method. So I will start with creating a campaign budget. Cool. So here I am with my campaign budget. Just to explain the PHP-ism if people don't know, the bracket syntax is an associative array or a hash map or a map, however your language might describe it, or a dictionary. So we've created a campaign budget. Next, I'm going to create a campaign budget operation, which will construct this and then pass it to the API. Cool. So I've added a bunch. Here I've got the campaign budget operation. This is a little similar to AdWords. There were operations to create as well, but I think they were called add instead of create. And then we create the campaign budget we defined up above, and then we pull out a campaign budget surface client, and then we perform a mutate budgets call, and that takes a customer ID, which is what I referred to earlier in the webinar, where customer IDs now go in the arguments or the parameters for calls, and then an array of campaign budget operations. So there's only one in this case. Great. So the other thing I'm going to demonstrate below this, let me just center this. The thing I'm going to demonstrate below this is pulling out some details from the response and then actually getting a campaign budget object. Cool. So I've added a couple of lines here. Let's go through these, right? So from the response, we get the results from it, and then we get the resource name. And remember, we didn't explicitly ask for a mutable resource, and so we're only getting the resource name back. Then I make a call to this method I haven't implemented yet, which is the getCampaignBudget method, and that pulls out the full campaign budget resource and just print things to confirm that they work and then return this budget. So let's go ahead and implement this getCampaignBudget method. So I'm going to move down and I'm going to add that method. Cool. So I've added this method, the getCampaignBudget method. Let's walk through exactly what it does. So arguments are pretty straightforward. Google Ads API client, or Google Ads client rather, customer ID, and then the resource name for the campaign budget that we just created. Now let's walk through how we're actually getting the campaign budget. So we get a Google Ads service client, and as I mentioned in the webinar, this is how you interact with search stream and plain old search, as well as get, although we're not going to be using get because let's assume this is kind of like a pseudo production environment, right? So here's the query I construct. I'm grabbing a campaign budget ID, name, and resource name. And I'm grabbing this from the campaign budget resource, and then I select only the campaign budget where the resource name is equal to the resource name that we passed in up above. Great. And then something to keep in mind again is only the fields that I've selected will actually be populated in the returned object. So then in the what we do next is perform the actual search, passing in the customer ID like before in the query, and then also passing in a page size. And I have this constant defined. I guess I don't have it defined yet, so I should probably define that up at the top. Let's do that right here. Cool, so I have this constant defined. Let's move back down and then explain the rest. So perform the search, and then we go through we use the response to get the campaign budget. And since search is something that returns pages, we have an iterator for that, and then we end up getting the campaign budget and returning that. And we end up using that back above over here on get campaign budget. Oops, there we are. Get campaign budget, and we end up printing some details from that. Cool. So this is the first step. Let's go ahead and continue on, and we're going to add, kind of transform the next piece of this. So the next thing I'm going to do is follow the same pattern of moving calls into if statements, and I'm going to now also fork on creating a campaign. So let me just center this and add that if statement. Great. And actually the other thing I did as well is I pulled out the campaign budget ID from above, because I kind of want to demonstrate that we're beginning to tie things together in such a way where we can use either API for any of these steps, and I'll demonstrate that at the very end. So now the first clause in my if statement is creating a campaign via the Google Ads API. And since it's true, we're going to not do this via the AdWords API. So let's move into the Google Ads API class and implement the new create campaign method. Let me just go to the bottom here. So I will end up adding it right here. Cool. So I've added the create campaign method, and I've also added the get campaign method, which just like before where I demonstrated getting a campaign budget, I'm going to do that same demo for create campaign. So let's go ahead and start implementing the create campaign method. Okay, so I've actually added a little bit more this time than I did last time, because I hope you folks are getting the hang of this. And I left a little bit of a blank as well that I'm going to fill in a second. So we create a campaign. There's going to be a bunch of arguments that we pass into that construction that we'll get to in a second. We create the campaign operation and set it to create just like we did before, get a service client, perform the request, and then demonstrate the result later by using the method that we'll fill in as well, which is get campaign. Now I want to focus on a little bit of what goes into the new campaign construction. So I'm going to add that now. Cool. So I've added a bunch. Let's kind of go through this, right? So adding a name, advertising channel type, then setting the campaign to pause. It's kind of a best practice to make sure it doesn't serve ads immediately. Setting the manual CPC, and adding the campaign budget. And this is the one that we created earlier, right? So this is something I want to demonstrate, right? The resource names class has a bunch of helper methods that allow you to construct resource names. So in this case, we're calling the for campaign budget and passing in a customer ID and campaign budget ID. And that's going to look like that URI that I showed earlier in the webinar. Setting network settings, and then setting a start date and end date. None of this is super dramatically different with the exception of passing in a resource name for the campaign budget. So nothing else has changed in this method, but we still need to implement the get campaign method down below. This has an empty implementation at the moment, so I'm going to go ahead and add that now, but let me just center this so that you can see it more clearly. Cool, so went ahead and added that. This is also very similar to the get campaign budget. We have a GACL query. We're getting an ID, a name, a resource name, and we're limiting it to a very specific resource name, the one that we passed in the function argument. Then we perform the search. We use the same page size as before, and just as before, we use the iterator in the response to get the campaign itself. Cool. So we've implemented both of these things. Now let's switch back to the campaign management class and utilize them, or make sure that we utilize them. Right, I actually forgot that we had already written this. We were calling the method before we'd implemented it. Cool, so let's run this and see what happens. Cool, so I've switched over to my other tab, and let me go ahead and run that example. Crossing my fingers that everything works. So far, so good. Actually, yeah, it looks like we're in good shape. Let me just highlight something here. This might not be super obvious, but these two methods, or these two log lines, are now being generated by the Google Ads API stack rather than the AdWords API stack. We still have clearly it looks like a bunch of that we still need to do. That's still being done in AdWords. So let me go ahead and do that now. Right, so the next piece that we're going to do is switch over ad groups, creating ad groups to the Google Ads API. So just like before, I'm going to add these to an if statement and kind of add that to the Google Ads API class. Great. Okay, so I've added that. Same deal as before. The Google Ads API side is on, the AdWords side is off, and I also kind of pulled out the campaign ID just to demonstrate how we can kind of keep these agnostic of the API we're using for certain implementations. So let me move over to the Google Ads API file now and add the create ad group method. And same thing as before, I'm also going to implement, or rather an add and get ad group method too. Let me just center this. Cool, so I've added the create ad group method and the get ad group method that I'm going to use to kind of demonstrate fetching. So now I'm going to add the body of the create ad group method, and then after that I'll add the body of the get ad group method. Cool, so I've added a bunch, so we'll kind of walk through it now, right? So I've got the ad group creation, and same as before, we're also using resource names now. So we're pulling creating a resource name for a campaign, which there's a helper method for. We've got a name set, we've got a status type, and bids. So then we have, oops, sorry, let me center this. We've got the construction of an ad group operation and setting it to the ad group we made, and pull out a service client, and then we mutate the ad group, and same as before, using a customer ID and an array of operations. Then also like before, we pull out the resource name from the results, and then we get the ad group, and that's a method I haven't implemented yet. See empty body here. I'll add that in just a second. And then once we have that ad group, we print out its content. So, oops, just kidding. Cool, so I'm going to go ahead and add the ad group now. Great, so I've added the body of this. Let's just kind of quickly go through it, but you should be getting the hang of this now, the pattern here. So we have a GACL query to get the ad group, and it specifies the resource name that we're looking for. We perform the search, and then we pull the ad group out of the response. So now let's go back and confirm that all of this works correctly with the switch that we made earlier, and I'll switch over to the other tab. Cool, so I'm in this other tab. Let me go ahead and run our example one more time. That looks good. And sweet, we added an ad group, and let me just highlight this. So these three components are now being run via the Google Ads API rather than the AdWords API. Everything else that has this kind of noisy output is the AdWords API. So now I will switch back and we'll continue this, and I'm going to kind of auto-complete the rest of this to an even greater degree so that we make good use of time. So in campaign management, the next couple of pieces that we're going to do, I'll do is implement and add switches for the AdWords API, or rather for creating text ads and creating keywords. Let me just center that. Cool, so I added that. So let me summarize what I did, right? I'm following the pattern from before, pulling out the ad group ID just so it's a little clearer. I've added a switch or a fork point for creating text ads, and the on section is for the Google Ads API, and same thing for creating keywords. Another fork, and the on side is the Google Ads API, and the off side is the AdWords API. So now I'm going to switch into the Google Ads API class and add those remaining functions that I am referring to. Cool. So I've added the functions. I've added create text ads. I'll go through that in just a second. I've added get ads as following the pattern where kind of demonstrate requests there. Then I've added create keywords and also get keywords. So let's kind of go from the top back with create ads. Create keywords. Let's search this. Ads. Text ads. Great. Okay. So what's going on here, right? We're creating a number of ads, and we have some scaffolding set up to demonstrate this. And this is kind of basically one-to-one with the implementation for the AdWords side. Then we have headlines, description, etc. We create an ad, kind of the ad housing. Then we populate the resource names with the pattern that we followed before. So all this should be like pretty straightforward. Same thing with the operation, setting it to create, and this time instead of just one operation, we're accumulating them into a large number of them. And then we perform the mutate request, and then for each of them we pull out the resource name, and then we collect the resource names and use our get ads method to share the full contents of the ad. So let's go down here, and this is like proving that we've created the ad correctly. And now I'm going to show you the get ads function that we wrote following the pattern from before. So we join all of the resource names together to be passed into a GACL query string. Then we use that joined resource names in our where clause, and you can see that we're using the in operator now. And we select a number of different fields from the ad group ad. We perform the search, and then we iterate through the results. Now you'll see a slightly different construction here. This is the PHP flavor of it. It's going to be different for your client library, but we iterate through the results and fetch the actual ad group ad. And then moving on, this is what our keyword construction looks like. Again, similar with the exception of the resource names. Create an operation, etc. And same deal as before, we demonstrated with this new get keywords method. Cool, so let's go ahead and run this and confirm that all this works. All right, so let me go ahead and run this then. Crossing your fingers, right? Okay, we created expanded text ads, and next is keywords. Awesome, sweet. It looks like that worked. And this output, at least to me, is indicating, because of the way that this logging is currently set up, this is all being done via the Google Ads API. So now the cool thing that I'd like to demonstrate, that will also kind of segue into the next section talking about forking, is the way that we have implemented this actually allows us to selectively, at any point in this process, switch from AdWords to Google Ads. So for instance, let's say there is some issue I'm experiencing with the Google Ads API for, the way that I'm using the Google Ads API for creating a campaign budget. Let me turn this switch, let's flip the switch over here and use the AdWords API for creating a campaign budget, and let's see what happens. Just kidding. One thing I forgot is that there's no get ID method on the AdWords flavor. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite some of this just a tiny bit. So let's pull this out and add this to our branched code. And then something to keep in mind with PHP, variables defined within if statements are actually hoisted out. Get budget ID. Cool. Great. So now let me run this one more time. That's now the correct method. Cool. So what we should see is the first method that we're calling is via the AdWords API, and then this is Google Ads API, etc. Sweet. So now, if I switch back to this, what I'd really like to show off is that we can take any arbitrary step in this and switch it. So for instance, I'm switching now the creation of ad groups from the Google Ads API back to the AdWords API. And we go back and run the example again, crossing fingers, right? Awesome. So just to highlight this, right? This is the, what method was it? I just switched, I think the creation of ad groups that's happening in the AdWords API, campaigns being added in the Google Ads API, and then AdWords API. So this is now kind of, we're weaving, or demonstrating that you can weave kind of between these two. Cool. So that concludes the kind of the live demo portion. I'm going to move back to slides and talk a little bit more about what strategies you'll want to use in forking, and transition to talking about migrating traffic rather than just migrating code. So as I was saying, another part of this migration will be migrating traffic from the AdWords API to the Google Ads API. We strongly recommend an incremental or phased approach. Don't just flip a switch and have all traffic moved from the AdWords API to the Google Ads API at once. So that's where forking comes in. And that's what I was demonstrating to some degree in the live coding example before this, where forking is the deliberate selection of a code location that determines how the app routes traffic based on specific conditions, and then the appropriate cloning of subsequent code paths. So in my example, that was the kind of rough duplication of the AdWords API class with the new Google Ads API class and the same kind of high-level director functions. And the thing that I didn't get a chance to demonstrate is that you can actually be very creative with the conditions. You can do things like enable the AdWords API, or rather the Google Ads API for specific users or specific dates, or by probabilities, where 1 out of 10 users experiences the Google Ads API and the other 90% experience the AdWords API. You can also do this test via versus production users, or even by host. So there's a lot of power that you have here. And the thing to keep in mind is some of these conditions require more work than others, and some require specific forking locations. So it's very important to decide this location and these conditions early on in the process before you start writing any code. Next, I'm going to review a couple of potential locations for forking. So here's a diagram representing your app. On the left is our API, and then proceeding rightwards are various layers of abstraction in your app, starting with the methods in your app that call our API, then the classes or files that contain those methods, and then the backend services that contain those classes or files, and then finally your whole app. Here's one way you might consider forking, which would be adding if statements to all of your API calling methods. Except we actually strongly recommend against doing this. For one, the AdWords API and Google Ads APIs are so different that for many routes, it's simply not possible. And two, the code you'd need to bridge between the two different method signatures and return types would be extremely gnarly. So we really recommend against trying to write a layer that force fits AdWords and Google Ads API. So then let's move up a layer of abstraction. This is actually the forking strategy that I demonstrated in the live coding demo, where you would duplicate all classes or files used for the Ads API logic, with the clones modified for use with the Google Ads API. Although in my demo, I didn't necessarily clone as much as I incrementally added those features to the duplicates. And then I used if statements in the callers to determine which class to use. So the one thing to keep in mind is if you fork this way, the different variants of the class should not be forced to have the same method signatures or return types. The caller should deal with these incompatibilities. And that's also something I demonstrated as well when I used the get budget ID versus get ID methods on the AdWords variant versus the Google Ads variant. So the next layer up would involve a duplication of your entire backend service, and then with the if statement actually living at a load balancer or routing layer. And then there are some Google Ads developers that have treated this as a completely greenfield project and have essentially forked at the entire app level. If you ask us, our guidance is to fork somewhere within the classes and backend services, somewhat close to the example that I demonstrated, but also to potentially much larger in scope, where routing actually ends up being delivered to a different backend depending on what your condition is set to. We think the range here is the least risky and most stable way of migrating, and it ensures a certain degree of encapsulation and isolation of incompatible API code. So this migration is going to involve a lot of work, and this webinar and our documentation and our future webinars are here to support you. We also think that you can look at this as an opportunity. The Google Ads, the product, is 20 years old, and when our team started rewriting the API, they saw this as an opportunity to pay down a lot of technical debt, and we think that this can be an opportunity for you too. Maybe treating this like a greenfield project is a way of really pushing your app forward. Going forward, there are some key dates for us to review. The Google Ads API reached parity with the AdWords API in April of this year, and then from that point, we announced a 1-year sunset period before we would shut off the AdWords API. So that date is April 2022. The migration is a significant undertaking with many moving parts, so I highly encourage you to start this as soon as you can. Start early and work incrementally. We also have some resources to support you in this. Some of these I'd like to highlight are our past webinars and our migration guide. These are pivotal to ensuring a stable migration. I highly recommend you check them out before you start your migration to the Google Ads API. I hope this has been helpful and useful to you. Thanks for attending the Migrating to the Google Ads API webinar. And with that, we'll take questions. Please click the link at the top of the screen to add questions or to upvote others. Devin is going to be our question moderator. Devin, can you take it from here?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sasha. That was terrific. So we're going to jump into the Q&A here. And like Sasha, I'll cross my fingers that this is all working as expected. So it looks like we've got the Q&A screen here. In addition, I'm going to, so the Q&A link is no longer at the top of the screen. It's also in the description of the event. So feel free to add your questions as we go along. Before we begin, I just want to introduce the folks who will be fielding questions. So of course we have Sasha Friedenberg, who just gave that terrific webinar. We have Adam Oren, who is a developer relations engineer on our team. We have Nadine Wong, who is the lead of the, she leads developer relations for the Google Ads API. And we also have Eric Schwaum, who is the engineering lead for the Google Ads API. So a lot of great minds who have a lot of influence and knowledge about the product. So a great opportunity to pose any questions. So with that, let's jump right in. So the first question we have at the top that was looks like it was upvoted several times is about an announcement. related to deprecating URL performance report. And the question is, what is the roadmap for the next months? Do you plan to deprecate other reports until global deprecation of the AdWords API?
Sure, no problem. Hello, folks. Nadine here. To answer your question, in order to add new features and campaign types for the overall Google Ads product, sadly, we sometimes need to deprecate features. It's a kind of the price we have to pay for moving forward. The AdWords API has not had a release since September 2018, and we aren't adding new features in order to support these new campaign types. So as the features are deprecated in the overall Google Ads product, you'll see it deprecated in the AdWords API as well. The thing is, as soon as we know about a deprecation or a change that's happening, we inform you through the blog, just like you saw. So we recommend subscribing to the blog. Overall, the answer is yes, it is very likely that you'll see a few more things get deprecated in the AdWords API over the next couple of months. We don't necessarily have a set roadmap, but as soon as we have the information available, we'll send it to you through the blog. All right, I think I can take that one as well. So the way it works with RMF is that just like with the AdWords API, RMF applies also to the Google Ads API. So nothing really has changed here when it comes to the requirements. The requirements are still there. You can check in the Google Ads API documentation. There is a page where we mention RMF and how it works, and you'll see it's similar to what you see on the AdWords API page. One thing to keep in mind is we are trying to make it as simple as possible, where as you're migrating, you can achieve RMF compliance by using either the AdWords API, the Google Ads API, or a combination of the two. So there are a bunch of folks who, what they end up doing is part of their implementation is an AdWords API, part of it is in Google Ads API. That's fine. We'll just make sure that you're reaching RMF somewhere between the two of them.
The next upvoted question is another question about reporting discrepancies. I'm not sure if I got to the first one just yet, but the question is, since all criteria level reports in the new API are multi-attribution, does that mean the totals for each of those reports will always match the campaign totals in the UI unless they were explicitly designed not to, such as managed placements?
Sure, I can take that one, Devin.
This is Eric Schwelm, the engineering lead for the Google Ads API.
Yeah, thanks. So the answer to that question is yes. With the change in how criteria are attributed, the API and the UI are now using the same overall model for how to report stats. So you can expect them to match unless there are differences in the API, in which case that will be documented as being different.
Terrific. Thanks, Eric. So the next question, which is not quite a question, was about the Node.js library. But the question is, too bad Node.js was not considered for libraries. Rephrase this as a question, have you considered Node.js for client libraries?
Hi, folks. This is Adam, developer relations engineer in London. I see somebody else in the Q&A has pointed out and suggested that the open source library maintained by Optio at npm.js.com/google-ads-api might be a good option. So I would recommend that as a great place to start. If you're working with Node.js, please explore the open source community contributions that we have out there. I'd also highlight that the Google Ads API does have a REST interface supporting native JSON over HTTP that might be helpful, though we don't have full client libraries, say for the Perl implementation, that use the REST API. So give both of those options a shot, and if that still doesn't suit your needs, please give us that feedback either on the forum or contact us directly, Google Ads API-support@google.com, just so we know that what you're in need of, and we can address that over time. Make sure that all the developers have the resources they need.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you to the anonymous poster who gave that suggestion. We love when the community can help each other out with answers to questions like these. The next question, are there plans to support video campaign mutate functions?
Sure, I can take that one. So right now, there are no plans to add video campaign mutates to the API, but thanks for the feedback, and we'll pass that along to the relevant teams and see if that can be added or not.
Great, thanks, Eric. So just refreshing the page, seeing where the next new question is. This is a good question here. Similar to mapping between AdWords services to Google Ads services, is there a mapping between error codes between the two APIs?
Hey, Sasha from the webinar here. So at this time, there actually is no document to map between error codes between the two APIs, but we will look into making one. I will also say that there's the webinar that I mentioned earlier that covers error handling. I think would help a lot with that too. And you can find that webinar by clicking on the channel link for this kind of live stream. The other thing I'd say is overall, the errors are mostly the same as the AdWords API, so just keep that in mind.
Thanks, Sasha. And that also reminds me that following the webinar, we will be posting a link to the slide deck that Sasha shared, that Sasha presented earlier. So you'll have access to all of the links and resources that we went through. So the next question here, and I think this was the question referenced earlier, is the detail placement view in the Google Ads API has discrepancies between the campaign level data and where ads showed in the UI. I would expect the sum of all impressions in where ads showed to be the same as the total video of the video campaign. I guess the question here is, why wouldn't they be the same?
So, hey folks, it's Adam again. For this question, I'd suggest reaching out to our support team directly at Google Ads API-support@google.com. So like Eric mentioned in the previous answer to one of the questions, we are aiming for to have much more consistency between the UI and the API as far as metric parity. And this is definitely something we can work with you to investigate and get to the bottom of on an individual basis. So please feel free to reach out to us there or on the forum, and we can work with you directly over email to figure out what's causing that discrepancy and get those numbers to match.
Great, thanks, Adam. So the next question is, when will V8 of the API with SDK come out?
I can take this one as well, Adam. So V8 released last Wednesday, as many of you may know. In general, we try to get the client libraries all to show up about a week and a half after the release. So you should see all the client libraries on various GitHub pages and package distributions showing up for V8 by this Friday.
Thanks, Adam. So the next question here is there a way to unit test a GACL syntax through the Google Ads client library without actually calling the Google Ads service? Trying to understand how we can keep code maintainable and bug-free because GACL is a string and bugs can be introduced.
Hey, I can take this one. Sasha again. So this is a great question. So we currently actually don't provide a direct way of performing client-side validation. There are a number of tools we have available to help outside of the client libraries. And actually, there's some tools that Devin, you have made. So on the developer side, there's the query validator, the query migration tool, and the query builder. So I think for your use case, which is to validate that a string is syntactically valid GACL, you'd want to use the query validator. You could also perform a validate-only request, but I don't recommend doing that for unit tests. There's also an addition to that is there's a great series of blog posts on the developer blog that show actually how Devin implemented the kind of client-side validator. So you could use that as inspiration for your own solutions too.
Great, thanks, Sasha. Thanks for the plug. To Sasha's point, while we don't recommend it for unit tests, validate only is a good way to do this programmatically within the client libraries. So you have multiple options here. So hopefully one of them suits your needs. And then the last question we currently have is, what do you think the estimated amount of time it needs to migrate a full service Google AdWords API client to the Google Ads API? A very good question. See if one of my teammates.
Nadine here. I'll take the tough one here. That's actually a really tough question to answer because it's very dependent on your implementation and how big your code base is. So I would say, like, as Sasha showed, like, if it's something that's like fairly simple and everything's very self-contained, where you have all your AdWords API calls in one layer, then you could do it fairly quickly. But if you have something that is like a mega huge code base that you're working with, it could possibly take a few months, which is why we're trying to get people to start migrating so early. There are some folks, developers we've been chatting with, who have already completed their migration, believe it or not, 100%. And for them, they said overall to do like planning, writing, testing, it did take them a few months to be able to get all of that done all the way from beginning to end, but totally doable. So sorry, I don't have an exact answer for that, but as you're doing your planning or if you have questions as you're going along, just please remember we're there for you at Google Ads API-support@google.com, and we'd be glad to answer any questions as you're going along.
Thank you, Andreas, for the question, and thank you, Nadine, for that great answer. Two key takeaways I would reiterate are we encourage you to start early, and we're here to help if you do have questions along the way. So I think that's the last question we currently have. I'll give folks just another minute to see if there are any final questions that trickle in before we conclude the webinar. All right, going once, twice. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate all of the feedback, the great questions, and we hope this has been a really educational webinar for you, and we look forward to continuing to produce content for you all to make this migration process easier for you. All right, thank you all, and take care.